Tonight on Greater Boston, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor Jill Winebanks joins me to break down day 5 of the January 6 hearings and to compare the crimes of Richard Nixon to the possible crimes of Donald Trump. A little later, we'll take a look back at my conversation with the authors of After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency, White House counsel to Obama, and a top Justice Department lawyer under George W. Bush, who came together to prescribe reforms that could protect future presidencies from Trump-like abuse and to debate whether he should ever be prosecuted. But first, another piece of major news today out of the Supreme Court, its first major gun decision in more than a decade, which is aimed at New York, but will almost certainly affect us here in Massachusetts. This morning, the court declared the New York law that requires people to demonstrate a particular need for carrying a gun in public is unconstitutional and violates the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And that means similar laws in California, Hawaii, Maryland, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and here in Massachusetts will likely be challenged as well. The vote was 6-3, with the 6 Republican-appointed justices apparently ignoring the words of late conservative Antonin Scalia in the District of Columbia versus Heller case that, like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. And for the record, a Politico Morning Consult poll out just a few weeks ago found 59% of registered voters support stricter gun laws. But who cares what the voters want, right? Rocket launchers next? And now to day 5, in which the Select Committee laid out the evidence in detail about how then-President Donald Trump applied intense pressure on dozens of people, from low-level election officials to the top of the Department of Justice, to help him steal the 2020 election. Just about an hour before today's hearing began, we learned that federal investigators searched the home of former Justice Department Attorney Jeffrey Clark. He's the man Trump was trying to get to replace then-acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen after Trump had appointed Rosen to that role just a couple of weeks before. Clark's also the man who was pushing a plan for the Department of Justice to lie to election officials in Georgia about having non-existent evidence that would force the state to change its election results, a plan that Trump lawyer Eric Hirschman summed up pretty well when he shared with the committee how he responded to Clark after a slightly more explicit insult.
A-hole. Congratulations, you just admitted a first step or act you take as Attorney General would be committing a felony and violating Rule 6C. You're clearly the right candidate for this job. Well, listen, the best I can tell is the only thing you know about environmental and elections challenges is they both start with E. And based on your answer tonight, I'm not even certain you know that.
I want to talk to that guy. Clark, by the way, also pushed conspiracy theories like Chinese spies using thermometers to tamper with U.S. voting machines. But back to his main moronic plan, a plan also pushed by Trump, according to former acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue's testimony, recalling his handwritten notes, recalling how the then president told him, quote, "Just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." And that the department had, quote, an obligation to tell people that this was an illegal, corrupt election. But it wasn't just once.
Between December 23rd and January 3rd, the president either called me or met with me virtually every day.
And it wasn't an argument he was just making privately. He made it publicly, too, like when he called into a young conservative summit.
The problem is we need a party that's going to fight, and we have some great congressmen and women that are doing it, and we have some great fighters, but we won this in a landslide. They know it, and we need backing from, like, the Justice Department, and other people have to finally step up.
But as Donahue made clear today, even if the claims about something going wrong with Georgia's election process were true, the DOJ had zero authority to do anything about it.
Both the acting AG and I tried to explain to the president on this occasion and on several other occasions that the Justice Department has a very important, very specific, but very limited role in these elections. States run their elections. We are not quality control for the states. We are obviously interested in and have a mission that relates to criminal conduct in relation to federal elections. We also have related civil rights responsibilities, so we do have an important role. But the bottom line was, if a state ran their election in such a way that it was defective, that is to the state or Congress to correct. It is not for the Justice Department to step in. And I certainly understood the president as a layman, not understanding why the Justice Department didn't have at least a civil role to step in and bring suit on behalf of the American people. We tried to explain that to him. The American people do not constitute the client for the United States Justice Department. The one and only client of the United States Justice Department is the United States government. And the United States government does not have standing, as we were repeatedly told by our internal teams.
Yet still, the president pressed on, publicly calling for a special counsel investigation, putting forth wild conspiracy theories he found on the internet, threatening to fire whoever wouldn't carry out his orders, which of course was nothing new, but which acting AG Rosen did not take lying down when Jeffrey Clark brought it to him, along with the idea that Rosen might continue to work under Clark.
He thought it would be appropriate, in light of what was happening, to at least offer me that I could stay on as his deputy. I thought that was preposterous. Told him that was nonsensical and that there's no universe where I was going to do that, to stay on and support someone else doing things that were not consistent with what I thought should be done. So I didn't accept that offer, if I can put it that way.
And the president said, "What do I have to lose?" And it was actually a good opening, because I said, "Mr. President, you have a great deal to lose." At some point, the conversation turned to whether Jeff Clark was even qualified, competent to run the Justice Department, which in my mind, he clearly was not. And it was a heated conversation. I thought it was useful to point out to the president that Jeff Clark simply didn't have the skills, the ability, and the experience to run the department. And so I said, "Mr. President, you're talking about putting a man in that seat who has never tried a criminal case, who's never conducted a criminal investigation. He's telling you that he's going to take charge of the department, 115,000 employees, including the entire FBI, and turn the place on a dime and conduct nationwide criminal investigations that will produce results in a matter of days. It's impossible, it's absurd, it's not going to happen, and it's going to fail." He has never been in front of a trial jury, a grand jury. He's never even been to Chris Wray's office. I said at one point, if you walked into Chris Wray's office, one, would you know how to get there? And two, if you got there, would he even know who you are? And do you really think that the FBI is going to suddenly start following your orders? It's not going to happen. He's not competent.
And every assistant attorney general that Rosen spoke with also agreed to resign without hesitation if Clark took over, according to Rosen's testimony as well, which may well be the only reason Trump didn't ultimately go through with the plan. I'm joined by Jill Winebanks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, tried President Nixon's attorney general, chief of staff, chief domestic advisor for obstruction of justice, since held several public and private legal roles, including general counsel for the U.S. Army, and she's also the author of The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, now in paperback. Jill, pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you. I'm glad to be with you.
By the way, great admirer of your work, even though you do tweet your Wordle outcomes, which drives me nuts. Having said that, it's great to have you here. So another day, another attempt to subvert democracy. What was your major takeaway from day 5?
It's a major part of the overall plot to undermine our election, to undermine our democracy, and the powerful testimony that we got today was really a good way to stop. The next hearings won't be until next month.
Yeah.
And you always want to end a trial on a high note. And this was really powerful. You had 3 lifelong Republicans who said, "I will not do corrupt things for the president, that I, at the Department of Justice, work for the people of America. I am not the president's lawyer. I am the lawyer for the people. I represent the United States of America." And they did the right thing at the time, were willing to quit their jobs, and they told the president that. And they laid out some very specific requests from the president, both in terms of facts and in terms of law. And they told him there's no fraud involved in this. We've investigated. It just doesn't exist. They rebutted very specific accusations that he made about the election. It couldn't have gone any better. It was really powerful. And it was questioning by Adam Kinzinger, a Republican of Republicans. So no one can say that this was a political job. This was getting facts out. And if only the people who support Donald Trump would pay attention to the facts.
Well, what'd you make of the pot of Congress people in that list who sought pardons? What should we take away from that?
We should take away that they are guilty. We should take away they have a guilty mind. They know what they did was wrong. And you don't ask for a pardon unless you think you've committed a crime. You don't need a pardon except for that. And I can refer back to Watergate. Richard Nixon, in accepting the pardon, was told very specifically when the offer was delivered to him, if you accept this pardon, you are admitting you are guilty. And there's a Supreme Court case that says precisely that. So they know they're guilty, and we now know they're guilty. And it was, the usual list of suspects were named, Gaetz and Brooks and Biggs, Gohmert, and maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene, not on the particular person who was answering it, but thought that someone else might have been asked by her.
So can we go from that Department of Justice to the current one and the topic of the day, of every day? You're Merrick Garland. You've watched this testimony. Enough to convene a grand jury, enough to conclude that a former president has committed prosecutable crimes?
There has been enough to convene a grand jury for, well, ever since the Mueller report. So how long ago is that? I've lost track, but that's 2 years ago. There certainly is enough evidence now. A grand jury is essential. And I think that the evidence now is so overwhelming that to let him go unaccountable would be a great disservice to our country, to the system of justice, to the rule of law, to our democracy. People who get away with this kind of thing will only do it again. And if it isn't Donald Trump who is reelected and does this again, some other wrongdoer might in the future. I think we should have indicted Richard Nixon, not just named him an unindicted co-conspirator. And maybe that would have been a precedent and a message. Maybe it would have stopped Donald Trump from doing what he did and what was laid out today.
I'm sort of a half-assed former lawyer. You're a big-time prosecutor. When I hear these arguments from credible legal analysts that there's no, I don't know what you want to call it, Masonic moment in the record where Donald Trump says to somebody, I know I lied. I know there was no fraud. That's not necessary to make a case like this, is it at all?
It is not. First of all, in most cases, we rely on circumstantial evidence. We do have one person said, he said to me, can you believe I lost to Biden? So that means that he actually did know he lost. But we have so many people telling him he lost. There's also an instruction juries get that says you cannot willfully ignore and disregard facts. That isn't how it works. If it's not convenient for you, you can't just say, well, I'm just going to ignore that because I didn't like that outcome, any more than the Secretary of State can say, I don't like how people voted, so I'm going to select a different slate of electors. That's what our democracy requires. And so I don't feel like we're missing anything in this case in terms of his intent.
Can we go back to those thrilling days of yesteryear you've referenced a couple of times? I'm sure you read the piece that Woodward and Bernstein wrote in the Washington Post on June 5th. I just want to read you a brief excerpt if I can. As reporters, we had studied Nixon and written about him for nearly half a century, during which we believed with great conviction that never again would America have a president who would trample the national interest and undermine democracy through the audacious pursuit of personal and political self-interest. And then along came Trump. I've heard you say in days gone by on MSNBC that there are a lot of similarities, but that Trump was a far greater threat to democracy. What did you mean?
I think that what happened in Watergate was a threat to our system of justice. It was obstruction of justice. It was perjury. It was paying hush money. but it never threatened our voting rights. It never threatened democracy. So I think this is far worse. And I think the big differences are the media landscape, where we now have silos of information and people actually believe some of the garbage that they're being fed by the big lie. I think that we also have political silos. We used to have bipartisan support. It was Republicans who went to the White House and said, you have to resign, or you will be convicted at a trial on the charges of impeachment. So I think this is more serious as a threat to democracy than anything we encountered during Watergate. That doesn't mean Watergate wasn't terrible. It was. But I think that we needed to have set a precedent and sent a message by indicting Richard Nixon.
Can we return for the final minute to a variation of what you said a minute ago when you talked about, I think pretty convincingly, maybe if Richard Nixon had been indicted, Donald Trump would have thought twice before doing what he did. What do you say to people who are convinced that it's been demonstrated that Donald Trump has committed crimes beyond a reasonable doubt, but believe it's not in the national interest to ever prosecute a president or former president quickly? What do you say to them?
I say they're wrong. I think that the national interest does require holding people accountable so that we don't see this a third time. I don't want to see another president do things that are impeachable or criminal. And unless we hold him accountable, that is a possibility. So I think we have to do it. And we only do it when there is more than ample evidence to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, not on phony baloney evidence. Things like, like Benghazi. There was no evidence there. Here, there's real, legitimate evidence. And I think even Trumpers who sit on a jury, as happened in the Manafort case, where one juror was a Trumper who said, I was a sworn juror. I had to pay attention to the evidence. And even though I support Donald Trump, Manafort was guilty. The evidence was clear. And I think that's what would happen here, too, is that the evidence would show and there'd be a conviction.
One piece of advice before you go, I'd switch to spelling bee if I were you. Just a friendly piece of advice. Jill, it's a pleasure.
I do spelling bee, too.
I bet you do. Jill, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thanks so much for your thoughts.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Today's hearing was the last one the January 6th committee will hold this month. The next one will take place after Congress returns from a recess sometime in mid-July. When they do, we'll continue to bring you the hearings in full on the radio, online, and on GBH's The World channel, along with our recaps and analysis right here in Greater Boston. But while the most attention is going to the attempted coup that, as the Select Committee is laying out, was driven by Donald Trump, that was far from his first legal transgression while in office. And that's why two top lawyers from the Obama and Bush administrations teamed up long before the 2020 election to offer more than 50 proposals that would address issues of presidential violations of norms and laws, as seen in the Trump administration and many others prior. They address issues from foreign influence, the Justice Department politicization, from war powers to nuclear weapons and more, and agree on virtually all but one. It's all laid out in the book. After Trump Reconstructing the Presidency, the authors joined me 1 week before Election Day. Former White House counsel to Barack Obama, Bob Bauer, and Jack Goldsmith. Jack is former head of the Office of Legal Counsel under George W. Bush. Bob is now a professor and distinguished scholar in residence at NYU School of Law, co-director of its Legislative and Regulatory Process Clinic. Jack is a professor at Harvard Law, co-founder of the blog Lawfare, and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Gentlemen, congratulations on the book, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So, as I said, dozens of important reforms. I wish you could do one of those base closing things where it's just up or down, but obviously that's not what's going to happen here. I want to pick a couple, if I may, of currently hot issues that Americans are thinking about and see what you suggested be done to address them. First, and I'm assuming this is yours, Jack, because of the Justice Department, Trump has demanded that his Attorney General indict his political enemies. You have a chapter on Justice Department independence. What would you do about that?
So that's a hard one because the president is in charge of the executive branch. And if he has an attorney general that wants to carry out his wish, that's difficult to do. We basically propose, first of all, let me say that we propose a lot of different things to get at the independence problem. And on that one in particular, We proposed simply to clarify that the Justice Department people who work there are subject to the obstruction of justice statute, something that's not well known, and also to clarify that something that's also not well known, that the department has a strong norm against politicization. But the reforms really go beyond that. We also, I think the most important reform that gets at that problem is to make clear that Congress has to pass a law that the president himself can be subject to obstruction of justice, criminal obstruction of justice. This is not clear now. It was a point of contention in the Mueller report. And that's probably the single most consequential reform that would put a check on that.
Bob, can I move to another one? The failure to disclose tax returns, which I think has been an oft-discussed topic. It was brought up in both debates. What do you do about that?
Congress can certainly enact a statute compelling presidents and presidential candidates, nominees to the major parties or independent candidates who are on the ballots of enough states to win 270 electoral votes and be elected to the presidency, could require that class of candidates to produce their tax returns. And the norm having failed under Trump, it appears that the time has come to do that, to take what was once a norm of voluntary tax disclosure and convert it into a legal requirement that presidential candidates have to comply with. I would also just add really quickly that that is one of a number of reforms that are needed to address financial conflicts of interest. We've also seen in this administration a president who essentially wants to run the country and be concurrently involved in running and promoting a business. This has revealed some really significant gaps in our regulation of presidential financial conflict of interest, and we propose reforms to close that gap.
Who wants to take a third one that I think a lot of people are concerned about, namely following in the wake of pardons or commutations that appear to most people to have been politically motivated, that the president may decide if he loses on November 3rd or thereafter that he pardon himself. My understanding was that the Constitution gives virtually unlimited authority to the president with no restrictions to pardon, but you guys seem to think that Congress could put some constraints on that. Who wants to take that one?
I'll take that one.
Thank you, Jack. I was worried no one was going to take that one, but go ahead, Jack.
Thank you, Professor. So you're absolutely right that, well, you're mostly right that the pardon power is among the broadest in the Constitution, the most difficult to regulate. It's sometimes referred to as absolute, but that's not true. And it seems pretty clear that Congress could pass a law that would not stop a president from giving a pardon in exchange for a bribe or to obstruct justice. He can't stop the president from doing that. But you can criminalize that act and criminalize that separate act and make it a crime either to obstruct justice or to take a bribe. And so there's a lot of concern about what Trump has done and might do in the interim if he loses the election. But that is at the top of the list of concerns. And the other one, of course, is the self-pardon that you mentioned. That one is completely unclear. Scholars, there's just no guidance in court cases. There's a takeaway sentence in a Justice Department opinion. We think Congress can weigh in on that, but it can't decide the issue.
You know, Bob, when I'm reading this book, and I became borderline obsessed with these reforms, by the way, to the point of almost an illness. I have to be candid. But as I'm reading them, first of all, I should make clear to people, this is not some anti-Trump screed on your behalf. You go out of your way to make clear that prior presidents often were doing some of the same things that he's done. You give the history, but I think you'd both agree that it's Trump-inspired, that he sort of elevated it to a level that hasn't gone before. So, Bob, directed at you, the concern I had is you craft reforms based on the norm and law abusing, for lack of a better expression, of this president. But it seems to me that they would only be effective against the president who didn't act like Donald Trump. That if you're Donald Trump and don't worry about breaking laws, you don't worry about breaking norms, you don't worry about congressional oversight because you just don't comply with it, how does this fix a Trump 2.0?
Our view is that where there is not a law and could be a law by reform, that it does operate to constrain presidents. It is true that Trump has repeatedly manifested indifference to law, but there are many instances in which it's clear that the existence of laws have in fact constrained him. And there are norms, in fact, even though he has resisted them mightily, that have constrained him. So we believe that where the law can be strengthened, loopholes can be plugged, fresh constraints can be crafted, and norms can be invigorated, the next Trump who comes along will at least have fewer weaknesses to exploit, fewer fissures to exploit in the overall structure against conflict of interest.
We only have a minute left. Can I quickly bring up a norm that's being violated that is not in your book? Bob, starting with you. How do we ensure going forward that Supreme Court nominations do not proceed once the people of America are already voting?
There's really actually no way to do it. The only way to avert this kind of sort of, if you will, constitutional bloodshed over Supreme Court appointments is to potentially look at reforms like term limiting Supreme Court justices so that every president is able to appoint them.
How about you, Jack?
Yeah, I'm afraid I disagree with you that there's a norm being violated here. It's clearly constitutional, as a clearly constitutional practice. To make the reform you want, you'd have to have a constitutional amendment, and it's not clear what it would look like. I agree with Bob that there's clearly something very wrong with the confirmation process. It clearly needs to be studied and reformed in some sense because the confirmation process has just gotten to be very, very destructive for the courts and the rest of the nation. But I don't think there's an easy fix for it.
Maybe you'll let me write that chapter in your next book, gentlemen. Jack and Bob,
Absolutely.
The book is terrific. I hope everybody reads it. A pleasure to see you both. Thanks so much for your
Great to
time.
see you.
so
Thank you
much.
very much.
The book, again, is After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. One other thing we discussed during that interview, on which Bauer and Goldsmith disagreed, was whether a president should be prosecuted for crimes committed while in office. Bauer was in favor, but at least before the insurrection, Goldsmith wasn't so sure.
I think we do have to have accountability so that the president isn't viewed as being above the law. I also worry about the establishment of a norm that's overread to immunize a president in the name of national healing or avoiding political conflict.
I think it would maintain the circus that's been going on in Washington and make it hard for the Justice Department to kind of move forward with the appearance of independence and impartiality. And I think it would just be bad for the country on balance.
But given what's happened since, I think it's fair to say Jack Goldsmith's stance has gotten more nuanced. In the New York Times just this week, he laid out the deeply complicated, in some respects, existential questions Attorney General Merrick Garland will have to weigh as he decides whether to charge Trump with a crime. He writes, a failure to indict Mr. Trump in these circumstances would imply that a president is literally above the law in defiance of the very notion of constitutional government. But he goes on to add, the prosecution would further inflame our already blazing partisan acrimony, consume the rest of Mr. Biden's term, embolden and possibly politically enhance Mr. Trump, and threaten to set off tit-for-tat recriminations across presidential administrations. Goldsmith paints the picture of a no-win situation in which the Attorney General must choose the path of least damage to American democracy, a decision I'd be happy to make. In the meantime, read the book and Jack's op-ed in full. That's it for tonight. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget Ukraine.